Everyone. Welcome, everyone. As always, I want to thank Dot for arranging this. I'm delighted to be with you again. I recognize some of the faces on my screen. So welcome to everyone. And it was Dot's suggestion that we learn about what's called Shemitah, which in English is the Sabbatical Year. Every seventh year, according to the Torah, the Bible, we allow our fields to be fallow. We do not plant and we don't fertilize, we don't prune. We give Shabbat a rest. And in the Torah, it's called a Sabbath, a Shabbat for the land. So that's what we're going to be learning about tonight. And the way I'm going to go about it is we're going to look at the sabbatical year, Shemitah, from an agricultural point of view, from a society and economic point of view, then the spiritual, and then the mystical. So we're going to cover everything from the practical to the mystical. But before we do that, I want to give like the bigger picture here of the meaning of the Shemitah year is that the Shemitah year is the seventh year. And as I said, the sabbatical year is called a Shabbat for God, a Sabbath for God. So to really understand the sabbatical year, we have to understand cycles of time in sevens to get the full picture. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the actual creation of the world, and we see that the first cycle of seven, of course, is the Shabbat. We work for 6 days, and on the seventh day, we rest. And this was encoded in the creation of the world. It's considered a divine cycle. Every seventh day is Shabbat. But now we'll see that in a sense, all cycles of time from a Torah perspective follow the same cycle of sevens. So the first level that we talked about was seven in relationship to days. Every seventh day is Shabbat. What about weeks? Is there a cycle of 7 weeks? Well, we do have that between Pesach and Shavuot, between Passover and Shavuot, when we received the Torah at Mount Sinai. There is a commandment in the Torah, a mitzvah, to count 7 weeks. And we actually count every day 7 times 7. And it's actually a mitzvah in the Torah. Every evening, we make a blessing and we count the days towards receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. And it's 7 weeks. So here we have a cycle of 7 of days and a cycle of 7 weeks. The 50th day is the holiday of Shavuot, when we received the Torah at Mount Sinai. What about months? Is there a 7-month cycle in the Torah? The answer is yes. We have what are called 3 pilgrimage holidays, meaning 3 holidays where people would come up to Jerusalem and celebrate the holiday together. It was a commandment, it was a mitzvah that we should come up to Jerusalem for these three holidays. The three holidays are, in Hebrew, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, I believe in English, is sometimes called tabernacles. All three of these pilgrimage holidays takes place in the first 7 months of the year. Pesach takes place in the first month of the year, Shavuot in the 3rd month of the year, and Sukkot in the 7th month of the year. And these three holidays are actually a cycle in of themselves. So now we have a cycle of 7 days, weeks, and months. And that brings us to the sabbatical year. That brings us to Shemitah. That in the Torah, we're told that we should work our fields and take care of our trees and everything in the land for 6 years. And the 7th year is a Shabbat that the land gets to rest. So now we have days, weeks, months, and years all going according to cycles of 7. The next cycle is very similar to what we said before, is that we count 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuos. And Shavuos is the 50th day. So the same thing with years. We count 7 sabbatical years, 7 times 7. So the 7th sabbatical year will be the 49th year. And then there's a special year called the Yovel. In English, it's called the Jubilee Year, the 50th year. And that whole year is also very special. It's like 2 years of resting the land. But soon I'll explain more about the sabbatical year, more than just resting the fields. So that is our 5th cycle. In other words, we count 7 times 7 sabbaticals. And the 50th is the Jubilee year, a time of freedom. The 6th cycle of 7s, according to tradition, this cycle of history will last for 6,000 years. And the 7,000th year is what's called the Messianic Era, when the Mashiach will come, the Messiah will come. Now we're told that it doesn't have to wait exactly to the 7,000th year. It can come earlier, very similar to the way where when we keep Shabbat, we bring Shabbat in a little bit earlier. We light our candles, depending on the custom, either 18 minutes before Shabbat, some light it 42 minutes before Shabbat, meaning we start Shabbat already in the 6th day. So here we have what we'll call the macro cycle of 6,000 years of history, culminating in a 7,000th millennium, which we call the Messianic Era. So now we have 6 cycles of 7. So there's one last one, which is called 49,000 Jubilee Years. Now this is a very symbolic number. What it means is after the Messianic Era, according to our tradition, we will move into a state of consciousness called the world to come. And that world to come is eternal and is infinite and is symbolized by 49,000 jubilees. So hopefully everyone's been able to follow this, that the number 7 is the divine cycle by which we measure all time, whether it's in days, weeks, months, years, cycles of years, millennium, and then into an eternal, infinite future. So that gives us an idea of where the sabbatical year kind of fits in Jewish tradition. So now let's start with the agricultural meaning of Shemitah. So I already said it's a Shabbat for the land, meaning just like when we observe Shabbat, we don't work. We rest. We do many other wonderful things, but active work we refrain from. That's what makes Shabbat so special. We put away our iPhones, and we put away our televisions, and we put away our cars, and we put away our work and our professions, and we spend time with our families, with our community, in joy, in prayer, in learning, in resting. And this is the meaning of the 7th year, the sabbatical year. When the Torah was given, the society was an agrarian society, meaning there were people who lived in cities, but the vast majority of people lived on the land. And so giving the land its rest, of course, for a whole year affected everyone. So some of the work that we don't do is we don't plow, we don't plant, we don't fertilize, we don't do anything to improve anything on our land, whether it's grass or shrubs or trees or flowers or anything. But you can do whatever you need to do to maintain what you have. And you're allowed to eat the fruit of the trees, and you're allowed to eat the vegetables as long as they were planted beforehand. So this affected, in the ancient days, almost everyone. And just like people would enjoy the Shabbat, this was a sabbatical. Now, in modern society, so in almost every culture in the world, there is this concept of leaving your fields fallow, not necessarily all in 1 year. Let's say someone has 1,000 acres of land, and it's divided into, let's say, 7 different crops. So the whole world has adopted this idea that every 4, 5, 6, 7 years, you leave one of the fields fallow. You don't plant it to give the land a chance to rejuvenate. Because when you're constantly planting and fertilizing and plowing, you're working the land, and the land needs its rest. So this is an agricultural practice all over the world now. But we did it all in 1 year. Everything rested. So now let's try to understand the implications of the sabbatical year. So the implications is like this. The Torah even asks, there's a very interesting thing. The Torah asks a rhetorical question. It says, and if you ask, what are we going to eat during the 7th year? How are we going to survive? If the whole society is an agricultural society, how are we going to survive? And so the Torah answers, and it says that, first of all, just like when we keep a weekly Shabbat. So what happens? I'm just giving an example. On Tuesday or Wednesday, we go shopping because we know that Shabbat is coming. And let's say we know that we're going to have a lot of guests this Shabbos. So we know we have to buy more food. And then on Thursday and Friday, all of the food is cooked and prepared. And then when Shabbat comes, everyone's ready for Shabbat. You don't have to worry about making food on Shabbat because we don't cook on Shabbat. So it's the same thing if we know that the seventh year is coming. So, and in the fifth and sixth year, a person would plant those things that can last in storage. And people would make their oil, and they would make their wine, and they would dry their fruits, and they would store their vegetables. And so when people would go into the seventh year, they were prepared. Now, of course, this doesn't affect eating meat or fish or dairy. Most grains can last for many years. They're stored properly. Most fruits, if they're dried, can last for many years. And we can eat the fruit from the trees. It's just that we can't plant new trees. So everyone's life revolved around the seventh year. Just like in a traditional Jewish lifestyle, everything revolves around Shabbat. The whole week revolves around Shabbat. So here, for everyone, in a bigger picture, the whole society would revolve around Shabbat. Now, one of the things that is special about the sabbatical year is that, like I said, we can eat the food. But not only can we eat the food, but the food becomes what's called hefker. Hefker means ownerless, which means that let's say I have an orchard. It's my orchard. I planted it. I work it. I sell the fruit. But when the seventh year comes, all the fruit in the whole country becomes ownerless, meaning anyone can come into my orchard and take food for a day. I could go into anyone else's orchard. We're gonna explain this in a more spiritual way, what it means in a few minutes. But this is a very, very special thing because we live in a world where if I own something, it's mine. It's always mine. But in the seventh year, all the land in Israel became what's called ownerless. And everyone could take whatever produce that they needed to survive from anywhere. And this is a very, very special concept. It runs against everything how the world works now. Another thing that happened during the Shemitah were loans were canceled. In other words, if people loaned money to other people, that this is a very complicated subject, so I'm not going to go too deeply into it. But loans were canceled. In other words, people would make loans that they would be paid back by the sabbatical year. But what happens if they weren't? They were canceled. They were canceled. And then one other special feature is there was a time when we had what was called an indentured servant, meaning, and it's not that different than the way we work today. The way we work today is, not everyone, but many people have contracts where they work at a factory, they work in a business, they have their own business and they have workers, but there are agreements. So in the old days, many times people, especially if someone was very, very poor and was having a hard time finding a place to work or finding something steady, what they would do, in a sense, they would contract out their work for a certain amount of time. But the way it worked is it would only go to the sabbatical year. Or actually it was to the Yovel year, to the Jubilee year. But a indentured servant would only be in service for 7 years. It's like maybe someone joins the army. If they join the army, they know that they're joining it for, depending on which country. But sometimes you join the army and you have to spend 3 years in the army. And then when you finish, you get all kinds of rights and bonuses. It was a very similar type of system. So in general, a person would only do this for 7 years. But if they wanted to extend it because it was good for them, they could only extend it up to the Jubilee year. Jubilee year was called a year of freedom. And everyone would leave their service. And one last thing, I already mentioned that in our world, it's hard to understand that I plant an orchard, I put the money in, I sell the fruit, and then in the 7th year, it's not really mine anymore. It becomes ownerless. And one of the verses in the Torah says that God says, "The land belongs to me. You are guests on the land." So even though, in a sense, it's mine, up to a point. So every 7th year reminds us that ultimately we're all guests here. And not even if we don't have a field or an orchard, we're all guests. That's our reality here. So now we've explained, in a certain sense, how the sabbatical year works as far as loans, as far as working. One last thing we didn't mention is another very amazing thing is, let's say I own a piece of land and I sell it to someone else. So the way the world works is, that's it. It was mine. You bought it from me. Now it's yours. But in the Torah, each tribe had a section of the land. It's very similar to, let's say, the United States has 50 states, and there are borders to the states. I would imagine in China also, there are districts or regions that are defined by borders. So Israel was established very much like the United States. Each tribe had its section of the land. So let's say someone sold their land to someone from a different tribe. So what would happen is, in the 50th year, the Jubilee year, the land would go back to the original owner. which means that you could only sell your land up to the Jubilee year. Let's say it was the 39th year of a 50-year cycle. So what it would mean that is you were selling the land for 10 years, and after 10 years in the Jubilee year, it would return to the original owner. So again, this is completely different than the way we think of ownership. Now, it's possible after the land went back, it's possible that a person could decide he wants to sell it again. That's possible. But maybe he'll decide the only reason I sold this land in the first place is my family was so poor we couldn't afford it. Now I can afford it. So it goes back to the original owners, the original tribe, the original part of the land. So if we look at all of this, we see that it's much more than just not working the land during the sabbatical year. The entire society was based around the concepts of the sabbatical year. And now we'll get to what we'll call the more spiritual meanings behind all of this. As we already said, and we can understand that one of the lessons that we're learning here is that the land is not really mine. It's a gift from God. And we're reminded of this every 7 years. We're reminded that no matter how much work I do in this world, it's only by what we'll call the grace of God that I can be successful. That's why even in the world today, we'll say there's two types of people. You have two people who are very, very successful in whatever they do, very successful. They become very wealthy. They become very powerful. But one of them attributes all of it to themselves. I did the work. I'm a self-made person. And whatever I've accomplished, it was because of my work and my initiative. The other person realizes also, if I would have just sat and done nothing, I would have accomplished nothing. Yes, I worked very hard and I did accomplish, but I recognize that without God's help, I would not have been able to accomplish this. And not only that, but on a constant basis, I am thanking God for everything that I have. So you have two people who have accomplished, as it were, the same thing, but the way that they look at it in their consciousness is completely different. The sabbatical year is to teach us that ultimately we are guests in this world. There's a famous story of a rabbi. He was called the Chafetz Chaim. And very, very famous rabbi, wrote very important books. He lived really only about 100 years ago. And one time, a very, very wealthy man was passing through his town and wanted to meet the famous Chafetz Chaim. And so he came to his house, and he was shocked, because this is a world famous rabbi. And he looked, and his house had very simple furniture, nothing expensive, very plain. And the Chafetz Chaim could see in his face that he was like, what? Why are you living like this? So the Chafetz Chaim said, and what about your furniture? Can you show me your furniture? And so the man said, how this is before iPhones. So he couldn't take out his iPhone and show him a picture of his house. He said, "How can I show you my furniture? I'm just traveling. I'm just passing through." So the Chafetz Chaim said, "I am also just passing through." So that's one of the teachings of the sabbatical year. But what does it mean that all the land becomes ownerless? So one of the meanings of the sabbatical year, now remember, the sabbatical year is called a Shabbat, just like the weekly Shabbat. And in our tradition, in the more, we'll call it the more spiritual way that we look at Shabbat, it's like returning to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, it was what we call a utopian atmosphere. It was, everything was provided for them. They just, whatever they needed was just there. In fact, we're told that the original humans in the Garden of Eden were fruitarians. They had all the fruit that they could want. They knew the secrets of all the plants, and no one owned the land, and no one worked for someone else. Everything was ownerless. So we're told that every Shabbat, in a sense, is like returning to the Garden of Eden. Now you can imagine, even on a smaller level, someone who works very, very hard for 6 days of the week. So you can imagine how much they look forward to Shabbat, to be with their family, to be able to rest, to think a little bit more, not have the burdens of running around and accomplishing and earning a living. But now we're talking after 6 years. If anyone's ever worked in agriculture, it's hard work. It's very, very hard work. And people work for 6 years, and then the 7th year comes, and I'm not working this year. This is, by the way, where the concept of what's called a sabbatical for teachers and professors. The 7th year is called a sabbatical year, where you don't have to teach, and you have time to do research, to write books, to write articles, to attend conferences. This is the modern concept of a sabbatical in the world of education and in scholastics. So this idea of returning to the Garden of Eden, everything is ownerless. So this is a very, very beautiful, beautiful idea. Now let's go to the mystical idea here. So we're going to approach it from 2 different levels here. So the first level is that in Jewish tradition, we relate to God in many, many different ways. God, sometimes we address God as a father. Sometimes we address God as our shepherd, our lawgiver, our master, our friend, and also our beloved. And in the mystical tradition, this idea of relating to God as a beloved, like a husband and a wife. So this is a very, very special kind of consciousness. And in the prophets, the great prophets of Israel, there are many, 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 many examples of God addressing the Jewish people as his wife or his bride. So obviously, this is a very, very intimate relationship. very, very intimate relationship. And in fact, we're told that when we received the Torah at Sinai, it was like a wedding. And the 7 weeks that we count, so this is like the 7-day preparation that a bride makes, even to this day, in order to come to the wedding and to stand under the wedding canopy with her husband-to-be. And we're told that Mount Sinai was like a wedding, and that the Torah was like the wedding contract. In Hebrew, it's called a ketubah, a wedding contract, which spells out the responsibilities that a husband has for a wife and a wife has for a husband. And so throughout Jewish tradition, there is this idea that we are married to God. The Jewish people are married to God. Now, what's interesting here, though, is we mentioned the Garden of Eden. And when we look at the account of the creation of Adam, of the first human, so it says that God created Adam, male and female, he created them. So according to tradition, however we understand it, is Adam and Eve were, as it were, like Siamese twins. They were one being. And then the Torah says that God took a side of Adam. It's sometimes translated as a rib of Adam, and he created the woman. But that's not really how we understand it. It's the male and female were a unified entity. More than just physically, mentally, psychologically. And then God separated male and female. And so what we learn is that every male has both a male and female consciousness, and every female has a female and male consciousness. This goes all the way back to when Adam was a united being. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is, so in one scenario, in relationship to God, we are the feminine. And this is not just talking about the Jewish people. All of creation is considered the female in relationship to God. But when it comes to Shabbat and the land, our relationship changes 180 degrees, where we relate to Shabbat, we become the groom, the man, and Shabbat becomes like the queen, the female. And it's the same thing with the land. We relate to the land as the female. And we know that in almost every culture, there's this idea called Mother Earth. This idea of there's something, because why? Just like women have the exclusive ability to give birth. So it's the same thing with the land, with the earth. The earth gives forth new life, vegetables, trees, shrubs, herbs, everything. You put a seed, just like the male gives the seed, and the female nurtures it and brings it to birth. So here we have, in relationship to God, Israel is like the bride, the wife. But in relationship to Shabbat and to the land, we are the male, the groom, and they are the bride. And so that's why every Shabbat, we in different songs or different prayers, we refer to Shabbat as the Shabbat Queen. And we relate to the land also as a beloved. And the place that we can see this is in the Song of Songs. It's a relatively short book of the Bible called the Song of Songs. And in the story, it appears to be a love story between a man and a woman. We understand it as an allegory of the love between God and Israel. But when you go through the Song of Songs, you'll see the whole story takes place in the land. And when the man wants to describe his beloved, he uses imagery of the land. And the same thing, when the woman in the story wants to praise her beloved, she does so through imagery of the land. So on a mystical level, we relate to the land not as something that will produce for us, that will create money for us, that we can sell and make a lot of money. We look at the land as a beloved. And the time that we relate to this more than anything is during the sabbatical year. Because during the other years, everyone goes about their business and we don't pay attention to a lot of things. We're all so busy and we all have a million things on our mind. But when it comes to the sabbatical year, to Shemitah, all of a sudden we understand the holiness of the land, the beauty of the land, our connection to the land. And as you all probably know, the Jewish people have a very, very deep connection to the land because there is no precedent in all of world history for a people to be separated from its land for 2,000 years and then come back to that land. Now, many people have a deep connection to land. That's absolutely true, absolutely true. But there is no precedent, there's no other example of a nation that was forcibly separated from its land, and even 2,000 years could not break our attachment to the land, because it's a mystical, divine connection with the land. And so I want to end with one last idea, is that one of the reasons we have a weekly Shabbat is because a human being needs rest. Now we see all over the world, whether it's Christianity or Islam, that have adopted a holy day in the week. For Christians, it's usually Sunday. For Muslims, it's Friday. But there's no doubt that the source of it is the weekly Shabbat, as is discussed in the Torah. And even when socialism and communism came into being, then there was a day of rest for the workers. Because it's even though we have now a society that works 24/7, everything is going 24/7. It wasn't like this even a generation ago. I was raised in the United States, and until maybe 30, 40 years ago, all businesses were closed on Sunday. You just did not have businesses open on Sunday. You had entertainment and restaurants and sports and recreation open on Sunday, but all businesses closed. Now the world is completely different. Everything is open all the time. Everything is going 24/7. But a human being needs rest. And that's the idea of Shabbat. But here we see something very, very deep, because here, when we give the land rest, the way that the Torah describes it, it doesn't say every seventh year is a day of rest because you, the farmer, need your rest for a year. The way it's expressed in the Torah is that the land needs its rest. So what's the implication of this on a deep spiritual, mystical level? Is that the land has a soul. The land has a soul. And just like we need to rest, the land needs and deserves its rest. So this is a very, very, very deep concept that we could actually go much, much deeper. And we actually see it because, and especially even modern research experiments, we now know that the whole plant world has consciousness. It's not our consciousness, it's a different type of consciousness. But the plant world, vegetation, has a consciousness. We know for sure that animals have consciousness. But one of the novel ideas is that even the mineral world has a certain amount of consciousness. And anyone can actually Google this because it has, modern science is astounded, but they don't understand it completely. Maybe not at all, but they see now that atoms have a certain amount of consciousness and choice. Anyone can Google this now and see, again, science does not understand it yet, but even an individual atom, and even a particle, even a photon, has a certain level of consciousness. And all this consciousness it means is everything has a spark of God. Nothing can exist without a spark of God. The more conscious we become, the more we realize how true that is. But one could go through all of life and not see it at all, be completely blind to it. But here we see, especially in the Kabbalah, in our mystic tradition, that everything has consciousness. It's not the same consciousness. It's all, each one is completely different in a way. So here, this is how we're going to end, is that in the sabbatical year, we're recognizing that there's life force in the earth. There's a soul. We have a relationship. And of course, this is very, very important when approaching the environment today. Because I would say until maybe 50 years ago, people were like totally unaware of the importance that we need to take care of our earth. We have to take care of our environment. That it's not something that we can just use and use and use and trash and trash and trash without there being major consequences for it. And of course, the big talk is climate change. And it's a big issue, but what lies at its heart is we have to understand that this is exactly what God said to Adam in the Garden of Eden. It says the Torah says he placed Adam there to guard it and to work it. To guard it meant you can work it, but you have to guard your environment that you don't destroy it. And that takes a certain amount of understanding that our whole ecosystem, there's life force there. There's a divine spark in everything around us. So I will end with a blessing that we all can see that. I bless us all that we're able to look at our world, mineral, vegetable, animal, and human, and understand that what unites it all is a consciousness of God as creator.